Angela Davis started her day like any other. The soft morning sun warmed her car as she drove her two kids, Malik and Jasmine, to school. The radio hummed softly in the background, and Jasmine was singing along to her favorite song, while Malik was buried in a book about space. Angela smiled as she glanced at them through the rearview mirror. They were her whole world, her pride and joy. "Mom, do I have soccer practice today?" Malik asked suddenly, looking up from his book. "Yes, right after school. Don't forget your water bottle," Angela reminded him. "Okay, Mom," Malik replied, giving her a wide smile. Angela loved moments like these. She worked hard to keep life as normal and happy as possible for her children. Being a single mother wasn't easy, but she was proud of the life they were building together. The drive was peaceful until Angela noticed something in her side mirror. A police car was following them. She felt her stomach tighten slightly, but she kept her focus on the road. "It's just another car," she told herself, trying to push away the uneasy feeling. But the car didn't pass. It stayed behind her, its flashing lights suddenly coming on. The sound of the siren made her heart race. "Mom, what's happening?" Jasmine asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and worry. "It's okay, sweetheart. The police just want to talk to me," Angela said, keeping her voice calm to avoid scaring the kids. She carefully pulled the car to the side of the road and turned off the engine. Angela took a deep breath as she reached for her purse to grab her license and registration. "Stay in your seats and be quiet, okay?" she said softly to her kids. Both nodded, their wide eyes watching her closely. The officer approached her car. Angela rolled down the window, offering a polite smile. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone steady. The officer's expression was stern. "License and registration," he said without answering her question. Angela handed them over, her hand steady even though her heart was pounding. She had always taught her kids to respect the rules and be polite, but moments like this made her feel nervous. What had she done wrong? The officer studied her papers for a long moment. "You were driving a car that matches the description of a vehicle involved in an incident," he said finally, his tone sharp. Angela felt her chest tighten. "Officer, I don't know what you're talking about. I was just driving my kids to school," she said, keeping her voice as calm as possible. The officer didn't respond, and the silence stretched uncomfortably. Malik and Jasmine stayed quiet in the backseat, but their worried faces spoke volumes. Angela tried to stay composed for their sake, but deep down, a storm of anxiety was brewing. Angela sat in the car, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. She could feel the tension in the air. The officer stood outside, flipping through her documents, but his expression gave no hint of what he was thinking. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of passing cars. "Mom, is everything okay?" Malik's voice was soft, but filled with concern. Angela turned her head slightly and gave him a reassuring smile. "Yes, baby. Don't worry. Just stay calm, okay?" Jasmine held her brother's hand tightly, sensing the unease but not fully understanding what was happening. Angela's heart ached seeing their worried faces. She wanted to tell them everything was fine, but even she wasn't sure anymore. The officer returned to the car window, his face still stern. "Step out of the car, ma'am," he said firmly. Angela blinked in confusion. "Step out. May I ask why?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ma'am, just step out of the car," the officer repeated, his tone growing sharper. Angela hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't want to cause any trouble, especially with her kids watching. But why was this happening? She hadn't done anything wrong. "Officer, I have my children in the car. Can you please explain what's going on?" she asked again, her voice calm but firm. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back and placed his hand on his belt. Angela's heart began to race. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she couldn't just leave her kids alone in the car without understanding why. "Mom, don't go," Jasmine whispered, tears forming in her eyes. Malik reached out and grabbed Angela's sleeve, holding on tightly. Angela took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. She looked back at her children and smiled softly. "It's okay, babies. I'll be right here. Just stay in your seats." Slowly, she opened the car door and stepped out. The ground felt cold under her shoes as she stood by the side of the road. The officer gestured for her to move to the front of her car, away from her children. Angela obeyed, her hands trembling slightly. "Why are you pulling me out of the car, officer?" Angela asked, her voice steady but firm. "We have reports of a vehicle like this being involved in a robbery." "You match the description," the officer replied flatly. Angela's chest tightened. "That's impossible. I've been driving my kids to school. You can check the GPS in my car if you want." The officer didn't respond, his eyes scanning her face like he was searching for something. Angela felt a mix of fear and frustration building inside her. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal in front of her children. Her thoughts were interrupted by Jasmine's voice from the car. "Mommy, are you okay?" Angela turned and smiled at her kids, though her heart was heavy. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Everything's going to be fine." But deep down, Angela knew the situation was far from over. Angela stood near the front of her car, the cold wind brushing against her face. The officer was now talking into his radio, his words quick and muffled. She could feel the stares of her children through the windshield. Jasmine and Malik sat frozen, their small faces pressed against the glass, their wide eyes full of worry. Angela wanted to go back to them, to tell them everything would be okay. But her feet felt glued to the spot as the officer turned back toward her, his hand resting on his belt again. "Ma'am, I need you to stay here while we verify some information," the officer said sharply. "Verify what?" Angela asked, her frustration starting to seep into her voice. "I've already told you, I'm just taking my kids to school. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't reply. Instead, he stepped closer, towering over her. Angela forced herself to stay calm. She knew her kids were watching, and the last thing she wanted was for them to see her upset. Suddenly, the officer motioned for her to turn around. "Ma'am, I need to search your car." Angela's eyes widened in disbelief. "Search my car? For what? There's nothing in there except my kids' school bags and lunches." "Step aside, Mom," the officer said, his voice cold and authoritative. Angela's heart raced. She didn't want her children to be scared, but this felt so wrong. She took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "Officer, I don't understand why this is happening. My kids are in the car. They're terrified. Can't we just talk this through?" The officer didn't answer. He reached for the car door, and Angela instinctively stepped in front of him. "Please don't do this in front of them," she said, her voice firm but pleading. That's when the tension broke. The officer grabbed Angela by the arm and pulled her back. The sudden movement made her stumble, and she gasped in shock. "Mom!" Malik screamed from inside the car. Jasmine started crying, her tiny hands pressed against the window. "Let me go," Angela said, her voice shaking. She wasn't fighting back, but the way the officer held her arm made it clear he wasn't listening. Nearby, a small crowd had started to gather. Some people were pulling out their phones, recording the scene. Angela caught glimpses of concerned faces, but she couldn't focus on them. All she could think about was her children, who were now sobbing in the backseat. "Officer, please, my kids are watching," Angela cried, tears welling in her eyes. The officer paused for a moment, his grip loosening slightly, but the damage was already done. Malik and Jasmine were crying uncontrollably, their terrified voices echoing in Angela's ears. Angela felt helpless, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over yet. Angela's heart pounded in her chest as the officer's grip on her arm tightened. She felt a sense of panic rise, but she knew she couldn't let it show. Not in front of her children. Malik and Jasmine were still crying in the backseat, their voices high-pitched and full of fear. Angela could hear their desperate cries, and it made her feel more helpless than ever. "Please, let me go. My kids are scared," Angela pleaded, her voice shaking. The officer ignored her. With one firm tug, he pulled Angela away from the car. She stumbled as her feet dragged along the pavement, her knees buckling slightly from the force. She tried to keep her balance but couldn't. "Mommy," Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking. "Mommy, please." Angela's heart broke. She had promised herself that she would always protect her children, but right now she felt powerless. She looked back at the car, seeing Malik's face pressed against the window, his hands trembling. Jasmine was sobbing uncontrollably. "Stop. Please, stop," Angela cried out, but the officer didn't seem to hear. He pulled her toward the front of the car, away from her children. She wanted to fight back, to push him away and run to her kids, but she knew it would only make things worse. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way to make the situation stop, to get her children out of this terrifying moment. The officer seemed determined to control the situation, his face cold and unblinking. Angela was aware of the crowd of people watching now, their eyes on her, some recording on their phones. It made the situation feel even more surreal. Why was this happening to her? Why was she being treated like this in front of her kids, who had done nothing wrong? She tried to stay calm, but the tears began to blur her vision. "Please, officer, don't do this. My kids need me. Please, just let me go back to them," she begged. The officer glanced at her briefly, but didn't respond. Instead, he roughly guided her to the sidewalk, moving her away from the car. Angela stumbled again, her heart racing, her mind spinning. She was terrified, not for herself, but for her children. What was happening? Why was this turning into something so much worse than it should have been? She could hear Malik's voice from the car now, calling out her name, his voice thick with fear. "Mom, Mom, don't go." Angela turned her head, trying to catch his eyes, trying to show him she was still there, still thinking of him. But the officer wouldn't let her move toward the car. Her heart shattered as she saw Jasmine's tiny face pressed against the glass, her mouth moving, but Angela couldn't hear her words over the sound of her own racing thoughts. Then the officer finally spoke. "Stay right there," he ordered, his voice harsh. Angela stood frozen, her body trembling. All she could think about were her children, who needed her. The fear in their eyes was more than she could bear, and it felt like time was stretching out forever. Angela stood on the sidewalk, her hands trembling at her sides. The officer was still standing nearby, watching her closely, but his attention seemed to be shifting between her and the scene unfolding in the car. The crowd that had gathered around now murmured among themselves, some of them still recording on their phones. Angela couldn't focus on them. She only had one thing on her mind: her children. She could hear Malik's voice faintly from inside the car, but it felt like he was calling to her from a far distance. "Mom, please, Mom, Mommy," Jasmine cried, her voice breaking. "Where are you? Please don't leave me." Angela's heart felt like it was breaking into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to run back to the car and hold her children, to tell them everything was going to be okay, but the officer was blocking her way. She could see Malik's small hands pressing against the window, his face pale and frightened. Jasmine's eyes were full of tears, her small face a picture of fear and confusion. "Officer, please," Angela said, her voice soft but desperate. "My children are in the car. They need me. They're scared. Can you just let me go back to them?" The officer didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, looking at her with a cold expression. Angela felt as though her words were falling on deaf ears. It was like the world had gone silent except for the sounds of her children's cries, echoing in her mind. A few people in the crowd stepped forward, offering words of support. "Let her go back to her kids," one person called out, their voice firm but kind. "This is unnecessary." Angela could feel their eyes on her, some of them nodding in agreement. But still, the officer did not move. His stance remained firm, as though he wasn't listening to anyone. Finally, the officer spoke, his voice more neutral than before. "We'll be done here soon, ma'am. Just stay where you are." Angela clenched her fists, trying to control the anger and fear that were building inside her. She wasn't sure how much longer she could stand there without losing control. But she couldn't let herself show it, not with her kids watching, even though they couldn't see her right now. All she could do was wait, and as she stood there, helpless, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. The uncertainty of what was going to happen next, the fear of how her children were processing everything. She wanted to go back to them, to reassure them that everything would be fine, but she couldn't. After what felt like an eternity, the officer finally walked over to her car. Angela could hear the sound of the door opening, and her heart skipped a beat. Was he going to make things worse? But when the officer returned a few moments later, there was no handcuffing or additional force. Instead, he merely told her to wait. He didn't apologize, but his presence seemed less threatening now. Still, the damage had been done. Angela knew this experience would haunt her and her children for a long time. Her mind was racing with thoughts of how to move forward. What would happen to them now? What would this do to Malik and Jasmine? She couldn't protect them from the fear they'd felt today. But she promised herself she would fight to make sure they never had to face something like this again. The minutes dragged on like hours as Angela stood by the side of the road, waiting for the officer to return. Her mind raced, but all she could focus on were her children. How were they? Were they still crying? Was Malik trying to comfort Jasmine? Angela could only imagine what they were going through, stuck in the car without her there to calm them down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer returned to her. He didn't say much, only gave her a quick glance before turning his attention to his radio. Angela felt a wave of frustration rise within her, but she kept her thoughts to herself. There was no use arguing anymore. "Ma'am," the officer finally said, his tone a little less sharp than before. "You're free to go. There's been a mix-up. No charges will be filed. You can leave." Angela blinked in surprise. She had no idea what was going on, but hearing the words "no charges" made her heart sink with a mix of relief and confusion. She had been standing there, feeling like a criminal, but now it was all over. Just like that. She didn't trust it, though. Something felt off. Her kids were still in the car, still shaken, still scared. She needed to get to them. "Thank you," Angela said quietly, but she didn't feel grateful. She wanted answers. Why had this happened in the first place? Why had her children been put through such a terrifying experience? As the officer turned to walk away, Angela quickly made her way back to the car. She could see Malik and Jasmine through the window, their faces pale and blotchy from crying. Malik was trying to wipe his eyes, but Angela could tell he had been crying too. Jasmine had stopped crying, but her wide eyes were still filled with fear. "Mom." Malik called out the moment Angela opened the door. "Are you okay? What happened? Why did they take you away?" Angela took a deep breath as she climbed into the car and shut the door behind her. She turned to face her children, forcing a calm smile even though her heart was still racing. "I'm okay, sweetheart," she said gently, reaching over to hold Malik's hand. "It was a mistake. The police thought my car matched a description, but it wasn't us. Everything's fine now." Jasmine looked up at her, her voice trembling. "Mommy, I was so scared. I thought they were going to take you away forever." Angela's heart broke. She wanted to promise Jasmine that nothing would ever hurt her again, but the truth was, the world wasn't always safe. Not for people like them. Still, she would do everything in her power to protect her children from fear and injustice. "I'm sorry, baby," Angela said softly, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "I'm sorry you had to see that. But I'm right here, and nothing's going to take me away from you." Malik, still confused, leaned against the window, staring out at the street. "Why did the police do that to you, Mom? You didn't do anything wrong." Angela didn't have an easy answer. She took a deep breath, searching for the right words. Sometimes people don't understand us. Sometimes they make mistakes, but we have to stay strong, no matter what. As they drove away, the weight of what had just happened hung in the air. Angela felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. She couldn't erase the fear in her children's eyes, but she would make sure they never felt powerless again. She would teach them to speak up for what was right, and she would never stop fighting for a better, safer world, for them and for everyone. The days after the incident felt like they moved in slow motion for Angela. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear the sound of her children crying, the fear in their voices, the confusion and pain that had filled the car. It was a moment she couldn't easily forget, and she knew neither Malik nor Jasmine would either. But as much as Angela wanted to move on, she knew she couldn't. What happened wasn't right, and if she didn't stand up, it could happen again. Not just to her, but to others too. Angela made a decision. She wasn't going to let this go. She had to do something, not just for her children, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated, for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. She picked up the phone and called a civil rights lawyer. The moment she heard the lawyer's voice, something inside her clicked. She wasn't alone. There were people out there who understood, people who could help her make sure this didn't go unnoticed. "I want to file a complaint," Angela said, her voice strong. "What happened to me wasn't right, and I can't just let it slide." The lawyer listened carefully, asking questions and offering advice. It felt good to finally speak up, to have someone listen, someone who could guide her through the process. But it was also scary. Angela wasn't sure what the next steps would be, or how long it would take, but she knew one thing for sure. She was going to make sure the truth came out. The next day, Angela's case made the news. Reports of the incident spread quickly, and soon, people in her community were rallying around her. The video of the traffic stop was shared widely, and it wasn't long before local activists, civil rights groups, and even strangers from across the country reached out to show their support. At first, Angela was overwhelmed by all the attention. It was hard to think of herself as a symbol of something bigger. She was just a mom, trying to do right by her kids. But as the days passed, she realized that this wasn't just about her. This was about change. This was about making sure that the next time a mother was stopped by the police, her children wouldn't have to witness the same fear and confusion. She began attending rallies, speaking at community events, and sharing her story. The support from the community was overwhelming. People from all walks of life stood by her side, not only because of what had happened to her, but because they knew it was part of a much bigger issue. Malik and Jasmine were with her every step of the way. Although the experience had shaken them, Angela made sure to sit down with them each night, to talk about what they were doing and why it was important. She didn't want them to feel like the world was an unsafe place, but she also wanted them to know that it was okay to speak up when things were wrong. Together, they began to heal. They attended the protests and spoke with other families who had faced similar struggles. The more Angela spoke out, the more she realized that her fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning, but she wasn't afraid anymore. The support she had found gave her strength, and she knew that together, they could make a difference. Her children would grow up in a world where they could stand tall, knowing their voices mattered. The days following the incident were tough on Angela, but the hardest part was seeing how much it affected Malik and Jasmine. They had always been strong, confident kids, but now they seemed different. There was a distance in their eyes, a worry that Angela couldn't shake off. At first, it was little things. Malik started hesitating every time they saw a police car. He would freeze for a moment, his eyes scanning the vehicle, his shoulders tense. Jasmine would ask questions about what had happened, but when Angela tried to explain, her daughter would retreat into silence, her small face full of confusion. Angela knew her children needed time to heal, but it hurt to see them so shaken. They shouldn't have had to experience fear like that. She had promised them a safe world, but now that promise felt like it was slipping away. One evening after dinner, Malik finally spoke up. He sat quietly at the table, poking at his food. "Mom," he said, his voice soft, "I don't like the way police cars look now." Angela's heart dropped. "Why's that, baby?" she asked, trying to keep her tone gentle. "Because, I don't know. I just don't feel safe," Malik admitted, his eyes downcast. Angela reached over and placed her hand on his. "I understand, Malik. I understand more than you know. But I need you to know something. There are good people, good police officers too. Not everyone is like the officer who stopped us that day." Jasmine, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Are we in trouble, Mommy? Will the police take you away again?" Angela's heart ached. She wanted to reassure her children, to tell them that everything would go back to normal. But the truth was, things couldn't go back to the way they were before. The experience had changed them all. And while she couldn't undo what had happened, she could help her kids learn to move forward. "That day was hard for all of us," Angela said, her voice calm but firm. "But we will get through this together. And we'll keep fighting so that no one else has to feel what we felt." As the weeks passed, Angela made sure to spend extra time with Malik and Jasmine. They talked more about the situation, and Angela explained that sometimes people made mistakes, but the important thing was how they responded to those mistakes. She wanted her children to understand that they had the power to change things, that they didn't have to stay silent when something wasn't right. She enrolled them in therapy to help them process their feelings, and she encouraged them to talk about what they were going through. It wasn't an easy journey, but slowly, Angela saw her children beginning to heal. Malik wasn't as afraid of police cars anymore, and Jasmine, while still hesitant, was starting to ask questions again, not just about the incident, but about the world around her. Angela was proud of her kids for their strength, but she also knew that their journey wasn't over. The scars from that day would take time to heal. But as a family, they were stronger than ever. Together, they would continue fighting for justice, for fairness, and for a future where fear didn't define their lives. Angela's heart swelled with pride as she watched Malik and Jasmine begin to smile more, their laughter returning bit by bit. It wasn't perfect yet, but Angela knew they would get there. They had to. Angela knew that healing wasn't just about time. It was about action. It was about making sure that what happened to her and her children would never happen again. After everything they'd been through, Angela couldn't just let things slide. She had seen how quickly her family's world had been turned upside down, and she wasn't going to rest until she knew they had done everything they could to make a change. She became more vocal about her experience. Angela knew that the more people heard her story, the more they would understand the need for change. She didn't just want to talk about what had happened. She wanted to do something about it. She wanted her children to grow up in a world where they didn't have to fear simply because of who they were. With the help of her lawyer, Angela filed a formal complaint against the police department, making sure that her voice was heard. She knew it would be a long process, but she was determined. This wasn't just about one mistake. It was about making sure that mistakes like this didn't keep happening to others. The more people spoke out, the more pressure there was to make real change. The case gained attention in the community, and soon, local leaders reached out to Angela, offering their support. They saw her not just as a victim, but as a voice for many others who had faced similar situations. Angela attended rallies and spoke at town halls, sharing her story and urging people to stand up for fairness and justice. But it wasn't just the community leaders who took notice. Even across the country, people who had heard her story began to reach out. They were parents, teachers, and everyday people who understood the importance of protecting children and families from fear. They all stood behind her, united in the call for a fairer world. As the weeks passed, the police department began to take notice. Angela was invited to meetings where discussions about changes in police protocols were taking place. It was clear that the attention her case had gained was starting to make a difference. For Angela, those meetings were bittersweet. She appreciated the progress, but she knew that real change would take time. Still, she held on to the hope that her children would grow up in a world that was better than the one she had known. She continued to spend time with Malik and Jasmine, making sure they knew that their voices mattered too. Angela helped them understand the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter how hard it seemed. She reminded them that even though one person couldn't change everything, together, people could make a big difference. One afternoon, while sitting in the park with her children, Angela smiled at them as they played on the swings. They were laughing, running around without a care in the world. For the first time in a long while, Angela felt a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect. They still had work to do, but they were stronger, and they were in this fight together. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Angela knew they had already made an impact, and that was just the beginning.